Middle Eastern trade shows are really interesting because they're just a melting pot of aligned and non-aligned countries. You have basically everybody's invited, and I don't think there's any other region in the world where that's the case. The Middle East is friendly with China, they're friendly with Russia, they're friendly with Europe, and they're friends with everybody, and everybody sees them as a chance to sell, to find new opportunities, and get gateways and foot in the doors to so many different countries and regions. We also have some free offerings then from Shephard's Defence Insights. This will be equipment entries, program entries pertinent to the wider market, but also the Middle East. If you stay around to the end of the video, we'll be telling you how to get access to those now. I'm Sam Hart. I'm the Senior Land Analyst for Shephard Group, focusing mainly on armoured vehicles, but increasingly things like UGVs and artillery at the moment. The Middle Eastern market today is very, very different to where it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, the Middle East was in the middle of things like Afghanistan, Iraq, and a number of other internal conflicts. Today, the internal conflicts sadly still remain, but a lot of those Western forces have now left the region. So for the Middle East, it's now all about stabilisation internally. So countries like the US, countries like the UK, France, those normal countries that had been in the Middle East for centuries at this point are no longer involved as heavily, meaning that a lot of these countries are now having to self-stabilize. Countries like Saudi Arabia are trying to make themselves the de facto hegemon, kingpin of the region. You've also got countries like Israel with almost a carte blanche from the US to be able to conduct whatever operations it wants within the region. So the focus of the region is no longer supported by the West, but very much now establishing itself as its own stable region. So for the change in the land domain, I think obviously the biggest one to look at then is the withdrawal of US Western forces, the rise and then subsequent fall of ISIS and ISIL and kind of the Islamic State threat within the region. And now what we're seeing is a lot of these countries are hitting a period of internal stability, in as much as there's no big players in the region that are causing large damaging effects to other countries, with kind of the obvious caveat of, say, Israel at the moment. But what that then means is that for countries such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE, it's a chance for them to try and establish themselves. And what they're doing now is kind of having a soft power battle. I think the easiest way to put it is a soft power vacuum within the region caused by the withdrawal of the West. And what we're now seeing is that these land forces are building up, a bit like how Russia and the EU used to do, with kind of a deterrence. So the bigger the army you have, the less likely you are to have issues with other countries. And if you're Saudi Arabia, the bigger army you have, the easier it is for you to become that number one within the region.
So there's a lot of saber rattling going on.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at countries like Saudi, I'm going to keep coming back to it, they, because of complex political and religious reasons, they have Mecca, is probably the easiest way of putting it. Mecca is within the country. They see themselves as kind of that de facto divine right leader of the region. Obviously, other countries such as Jordan, who have this kind of political influence due to their ties with the West, and especially Israel and Iran, who both want to kind of saber rattle as well and make sure that Saudi does not have it easy. It's a complex region with very different and changing issues, is the easiest way to put it. I think the biggest one to look at is the fall of Syria. That's probably less to do with Western withdrawals, but more to look at how Russia is affecting the Middle East. And that's a big point that was going to, I think, will come up in IDEX. So Russia, previously, if you look at a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, the majority of their armoured vehicle inventories are old Russian Soviet fleets. What's going to happen as we go forwards is that because Russia's old fleets are now being sent across the fields in Ukraine, they can't be sent to the Middle East. Even at WDS last year, Russia was basically saying we can only sell services and spare parts. They could not sell any complete products because of the trade ban that they have in place because of Ukraine. What this means is it's opening the door massively for China. So China last year at WDS, it had about a third of the trade real estate on the kind of the trade show. I think at IDEX this year, that's going to be another big thing, with China seeing an opportunity to sell more modern products than what the Soviet fleets that kind of existing in the inventories the Middle Eastern countries have, but also at a lot cheaper than what the Western countries that are somewhat trying to break into the Middle Eastern market can provide.
I remember IDEX a couple of years ago, the footprint of China was huge on the floor, and the Russian side was relegated to an external chalet that they had, which was far away from the convention centre. Yeah.
I think that's going to be a growing trend going forwards. Russia's influence on the global stage is diminishing rapidly. It's putting all of its assets and all of its resources into Europe, Ukraine namely, especially at the moment. And what that means is their power that they have in Syria, for example, is going, it's gone. That's one of the reasons that Syria fell, is because Russia could not support them. What that then means is China is seeing this as an opportunity to fill that gap. Their Belt and Roads Initiative in kind of the economic sense is very well known, very well understood. And one of the big things about that is taking advantage of other countries leaving their kind of soft and hard power from potentially economically vulnerable countries, and the Middle East has a number of those, and China filling in those gaps. I think that what we're going to see going forwards is China offering vehicles, everything to do with the defence market, economic things, and doing exactly what they've been doing so far, which is offering favourable trade conditions. However, these will be conditional offers. So it'll be things like, we will sell you armoured vehicles at a third of the cost of what Turkey, France, Germany can sell them to you, but you're going to have to give us access to a base on your country. There's great examples of that already in places like Djibouti, one of the smallest countries that most people have never heard of. It also has China's first international foreign base. This is why what we're going to see going forwards, and especially at IDEX, I think China's influence will be huge. WDS was a drop in the ocean for them. They're now realising just how much potential they have in this market. So looking at that region, there's not actually a huge amount of massive primes within these countries. Just from the establishment of the technology, we're looking either west, so looking towards Europe and the traditional players. We're looking way further east, so we're looking towards China. So Norinco is the one that springs to mind. However, Norinco and Chinese government are one and the same to a certain extent. So I think what we see at the trade show with Chinese flags on it is realistically just an extension of the Chinese government rather than a particular OEM. But the other big one to talk about is Turkey. And Turkey is finding itself in a really weird spot by its own design, and probably a beneficial spot to Turkey. So Turkey is on that weird cusp of Middle East or Europe, and they choose one when they want to, and they choose the other one when they need to. They're moving towards Europe. The vehicles that they're making, the vehicles they're producing, so looking at companies like FNSS, looking at companies like Otokar, Neural Machina, BMC, all four of those countries are now trying to sell directly into Europe, and all four are being fairly successful with that, while simultaneously keeping a foot in the door with the Middle Eastern market. The fact that they are a Middle Eastern country, at least geographically, means that they have those ties already, and they're being seen by the Middle Eastern market as a doorway and a gateway into the European market as well. So I think Turkey is probably going to be one of the other big winners coming out of IDEX. The biggest difference then between the European market and the Middle Eastern market is what they're trying to achieve right now. Looking at the European market, it's clear as day where the focus is. It's preparing for grand warfare against a peer threat. To put it bluntly, as they're saying at IAV, every European country you go and talk to now and ask them what their main focus is from a defence point of view, it is preparing for grand warfare with Russia. There's no punches held, it is grand warfare with Russia. You look at the Middle East, for example, they are probably a bit less worried about that. They're also not as worried about the previously known Asia-Pacific tilt and China. For them, China is more of an ally, giving them the access to the markets and giving them favourable trade conditions. So for the Middle East, it goes back to stabilisation, stabilising themselves internally and stabilising themselves within a region. The biggest threat to the Middle East realistically now is itself. This is probably the least involved that Europe has been in the Middle East in nearly 2 centuries. At least openly. What that then means is the Middle East is focusing on stabilising their own countries. So for countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like the UAE, it's creating themselves in their own image, having the chance to establish themselves and become regional players without influence of other countries. The only real exception to this then obviously is Israel, and to a lesser extent Iran, but Israel has done such a good job recently of systematically eradicating Iran's influence within the region and taking advantage of the opportunity that's been allowed by the US, for example, that Israel is probably the only exception to that, but also, paradoxically, the least likely now to cause a conflict with the rest of the Middle East. They know that they can't get away with that, so they're seizing the opportunity they have now, but will probably now not exploit that wider than where they have. Middle Eastern trade shows are really interesting because they're just a melting pot of aligned and non-aligned countries. You have basically everybody's invited, and I don't think there's any other region in the world where that's the case. You go to Europe and you can guarantee you're not going to see Russia, and you're almost certainly not going to see much of China. You go all the way over to the east, and for example at DSA in Malaysia in 2024, China had a tiny little stand because of the issues that they have geopolitically within that region. The Middle East is the only one where, weirdly, the Middle East is not involved in any external conflicts. Therefore, they allow everybody in because they don't have any opposition. It sounds weird, but that's pretty much how it works. The Middle East is friendly with China, they're friendly with Russia, they're friendly with Europe, and they're friends with everybody. And everybody sees them as a chance to sell, to find new opportunities, and get gateways and foot in the doors for so many different countries and regions. I think it'll be really interesting. Europe's in a weird spot and is now completely moving towards Russia. We're moving, it seems, away from kind of what China's doing, which will allow China to get their foot in the door more in IDEX. We're no longer as worried about China as we are now about Russia. So I think there's going to be opportunities for China to even look at moving further west. And I think IDEX for them is just this great opportunity to platform and be allowed to platform. And that's the big difference between a lot of the other trade shows. I think Edge Group is always going to be one of those that we talk about. It's a home market for them. They've been expanding relentlessly over the last 2 years, picking up different companies, both within kind of the Middle Eastern region and wider. I think Milrem is a great example of that. So Estonia, about as far away as you can get from the deserts of Abu Dhabi. But what that then means is Edge has the ability to open doors within the Middle East. So one of the problems that Milrem, for example, was having, so they couldn't sell into the Middle East because they just didn't have the connections. Edge opens those doors. And Edge's portfolio these days is so wide, so vast and varied that without a doubt they'll be there and they'll be out in force. I also think the Turkish players that we've kind of mentioned before, FNSS has got lots of friends in the region and they'll be looking to make more. Otokar, bolstered off the success it's recently had in Romania, will be looking to sell its 4x4s across the Middle East. I think the Middle East is in a really interesting spot at the moment where they're right on the cusp of modernising and they haven't yet made the choice. They're buying Chinese, they can't buy Russian, and if they buy European, do they go big European or do they go for the Turkish semi-small European? I think it'll be interesting to see where the Turkish programs are potentially. This could be the show they talk about them, it also might not, but with that, we're expecting information on kind of the Altay, the progress of their main battle tank program. There's been news coming out recently that they're starting to westernize them, but it could be quite interesting to see if they're willing to market it to the typically more frugal Middle Eastern market. You start putting things like trophy APS on vehicles, and they start getting very expensive very, very quickly. The other thing then we'll be looking to see if any of the FNSS and any of the Otokar vehicles start making headway within any of these Middle Eastern countries. They're all talking about a big game of modernising and upgrading their fleets. There's been a lot of courting, especially at things like WDS last year, of even vehicles like the Ajax, so a multi-million-pound IFV for countries like Saudi Arabia. But then in the hall next door, we're watching China bring out 15, 20-year-old platforms because they know the Middle East is more likely to buy those. I don't necessarily expect there to be big program announcements because the Middle East doesn't seem to do flashy announcements, but what they do like to do is make deals at these trade shows and then 4 years later we see them at military parades on Independence Days and such. Honestly, it's got to be the Chinese. Probably shouldn't say that out loud, but I'm very interested to see what they're doing. In the easiest way, it's nice to see what our country's competition is doing. We're looking towards Russia predominantly at the moment, and I don't expect to see much Russia at this show. But it's always good to see what China's coming out with, though I do caveat that with the fact that I doubt they'll put anything that's been built in the last 5 years on show. I'm also just always very interested to see what is the domestic market making, and I include SEMI in this, Saudi Arabia. GAMI and SAMI, they're two state-funded organisations, were huge at WDS. I imagine they'll be out in force at IDEX, and I also think people at places like Edge Group will be making some big announcements, possibly some new buying of other companies, and this is the kind of show that they're going to do a big push on to try and expand in the market. It's a bit of a varied role for me. I'll be walking around trying to see and gain as much information as I can. For me, as an analyst, it's a great opportunity to get my finger on the pulse of the Middle Eastern market. These trade shows come around once a year at the moment now, thanks to WDS. And I learn probably more in a week at these shows, talking to the OEMs, if I can, getting near a delegation, and certainly picking up from things like the press releases and the briefings. Any information, any kind of idea of the trends of the market, and it's a great opportunity for me to kind of get a better idea to inform our customers and build the DI platform. Yeah, so what we kind of do just with DI is we build up a whole database of the information on different vehicles, different platforms, covering everything from tanks to ships to drones, and everything kind of in between. We also do program updates. So what that is kind of Saudi Arabia is going to buy 50 of a vehicle and it's going to take this amount of time, they're going to spend this much money. What that means then is that that's part of the DI platform, and we're going to be releasing a number of equipment entries and program entries in the run-up to the show. These will be a mixture, so some of them will be pertinent to the Middle Eastern market, but there'll also be some insight into things like the European market. One of the best ones to talk about is one of the biggest ones we have, so we've got CV90, the big European vehicle, and then also the massive Italian program that's coming out at the moment, AICS, which is their big Lynx order, which is in the middle of going through as we speak. Yep, so links to these videos can be found on the bottom of this video. They can be found on our socials, and they'll also be emailed out to our email list. We'll also be writing domain-specific one-page briefs as analysts, so this will give you some insight into what we think is going to be the things to look out for, what we predict from the show, and then also what we hope is going to appear at the show. And these will be on the Defence Insight portal.
Well, Sam, have a fantastic time in IDEX. Abu Dhabi's good fun, and looking forward to having you again on the show next time.
Yeah, cheers, Jack. Thanks for having me.